Thanks for the invitation today to talk about southern resident killer whale diet and prey availability. As a lot of you are probably aware, fall season is a time when southern residents do come into Puget Sound. We have tried to get out with them opportunistically over the last 15 years and collect scales and feces. And the information to date from these two approaches show similar but somewhat different results. And at the top panel, you see scales and tissue, and the majority of those scales are from chum salmon, and then the second most common is from Chinook, and then we also have some steelhead and coho mixed in. But if you take a look at the fecal results in the second panel down, what you're seeing is actually more Chinook than chum, and a lot more prey diversity. So these fecal samples likely represent species that were consumed outside of Puget Sound, because as I was mentioning before, it takes a bit of time for once they actually kill and eat a fish for it to go through the digestive tract and come out the backside. So one of the other things that we were interested in looking at was the stocks for the Chinook that were represented here. And so basically when they're in Puget Sound, they're eating primarily Puget Sound bound Chinook, which is not a huge surprise given that it's late in the season and the fish are returning to their natal rivers. But it was interesting also that nearly 20% were of Canadian origin, and then we had some that were from well outside the area, including the Columbia and the Central Oregon coast, as well as the Central Valley. The next thing to tackle was what the whales were eating during the winter months. And the first question was, where are southern resident killer whales in the winter? And so during the years that we had satellite tag data, we basically were able to take a look at where the whales were spending their time. And so in the left panel, you basically are seeing that the whales, this was primarily K25, L84, K33, and L95. And what you're seeing here is that their range extended all the way from essentially the northern Washington coast all the way down to central California, but they spent the bulk majority of their time off the Washington coast, particularly between Westport and the Columbia. And then as far as J-pod was concerned, we had tags on J26, L87 when L87 was with J-pod, and J27. And what you saw here was a very different type of habitat use pattern during the winter, where they were essentially splitting their time between the northern portion of the Strait of Georgia and the west entrance to the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And so essentially during this time, we were able to follow whales and collect scale and tissue samples. So for the outer coast, what we saw was that Chinook, again, very similar proportion, about 80% of their diet during the winter off the outer coast. And that, and we also did see a couple of other species, primarily steelhead, showing up. And then when we looked at the stock breakdown for this, essentially most of the stocks that we were seeing were coming out of 4 different drainages, primarily the Columbia River, but also Puget Sound. There were Canadian drainages, particularly the Fraser was included. And we also saw a fair number coming out of the Central Valley. So essentially 90% of all of the winter prey was coming out of these 4 drainages. Over half is coming out of the Columbia River. And it's important to note that in the US, at least 12 of these, 6 of the 12 stocks that we saw being utilized are also listed under the ESA. One of the things that's happening is that this information, as well as other information, is being used to guide salmon recovery and management decisions, and this includes a number of different groups relative to the state's task force recommendations, as well as habitat, and then it's also driving funding through grants from, say, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, and some of these other groups that are out there.